As Myaamia, Miami people, it is useful from time to time to step back and take a moment to reflect on our history, on the efforts of our past leaders, and on the policies imposed on us by the United States government. To our nation, the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, the policies of the United States have oftentimes felt like a pendulum, swinging heavily from a position of national friendship to one of outright hostility toward our existence as a domestic dependent sovereign nation. Over the span of our history, our leaders and our people have worked hard to successfully respond to that swinging pendulum in a way that strengthens us as a community, tribe, and sovereign nation. As a people, all of our stories always begin with place, and so we begin this story with Myaamia, the place of the Myaamia. Myaamia is made up of all the places we have lived and continue to live, beginning with our original homelands in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, our later homelands in eastern Kansas, and our current sovereign homelands in northeastern Oklahoma. It is our lands in Oklahoma that hold the seat of our government, and it is the place where we come together many times throughout the year to meet as a sovereign nation. This tie to Myaamia is a cultural tie, a historical tie, and a legal tie. All three of these require a lot of effort and knowledge to maintain. As a people, we continually do that hard work by traveling and visiting with each other, and visiting, reconnecting with Myaamia, Miami places. In addition, our leaders engage in this struggle by traveling and visiting with different governmental officials at the federal, state, and local levels. Through this work, our community and our leaders maintain our connections, legal, cultural, and historical, to all of these places. We lived in our original homelands, what eventually became the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, since time immemorial. Historians or archaeologists might try to tell us differently, but our stories tell us that we've lived there for time out of memory. Our lives there began to change rapidly with the coming of the French, English, Spanish, and Myaamia, the American colonists, who later formed the United States of America. It was the coming of the Myaamia, the Americans, that initiated the greatest series of changes for our nation. The United States' first policy regarding Indian people was one of war. During this policy period, our people faced over 5 major invasions of our homelands, and we suffered from the resulting destruction produced by the fighting and the occupation that followed. The second policy period, treaties and land cessions, built upon the disruption that was caused during the previous wars. Our first major land cession treaty with the United States government was the Treaty of Greenville. From that signing in 1795, we negotiated approximately 13 additional treaties with the United States. As a result of this policy period, we signed away vast amounts of our homelands, largely against our will. Pictured in this slide are 2 of the leaders who served for a very long period that includes both the periods of war and treaties. They are not the only 2 leaders from this period, but Pakana on the left and Pinjoa on the right are representative of their times. They served for most of their lives. Their service only ended with their passing. They were servant leaders to the utmost for their people. Pakana served from the 1750s until his death in about 1816, and Pinjoa served from the 1790s until his death in 1841. The net result of our many treaties and land cessions wasn't the peace or stability we were promised, but instead removal. Removal became the official Indian policy of the United States government in the 1830s. The United States government believed that Indian nations had to move west of the Mississippi because they would not assimilate and become good neighbors to the American settlers who surrounded them. The explicit goal of this policy was for all eastern tribes to move west of the Mississippi, to what was called the Great American Desert. And in October of 1846, the Miami tribe was removed from northern Indiana. They were forcibly loaded onto boats and followed the canals and rivers west to the unorganized territory, a place that would later become the state of Kansas. Over 300 Miamis arrived there to begin a new life. After struggling to survive their first winter, they began to create a new homeland and a new community along the Lasine River. They did this without losing their connections to their historic homelands in Indiana or the family members who stayed behind. Unfortunately, quickly after arrival in Indian Territory, the U.S. government decided again that the Myaamia tribe was in the way of what the Americans called progress. Again, we were heavily pressured to sign away our lands and move away from American settlement. Due to the social disruption caused by the removal, our traditional system of selecting leaders shifted to respond to our new reality. It was a time of intense stress, and the community struggled to find leaders who could represent us to the best of their abilities. These leaders tended to work as a close unit, with the person at the top, the chief, changing from year to year. Later, by Thomas Miller's time, leaders served for longer terms as the community became more stable. However, the pressure to move never ended, and by 1867 the tribe signed another removal treaty that agreed to removal south to Indian Territory, as Kansas had become a state in 1861. Those who wanted to stay behind and live on Indian lands in Kansas were forced to relinquish their citizenship in court. They had to state that they were no longer citizens of the Myaamia tribe and agreed to become citizens of the United States of America. At that time, the U.S. would not allow anyone to be a citizen of a tribe and the U.S. By 1873, through a gradual process, the tribe relocated to the northeastern corner of Indian Territory, what would become northeastern Oklahoma. In the late 1800s, the U.S. government moved from its removal policies to a new policy called Allotment. This policy called for an end to tribal communities' traditions of collective land ownership. Instead, the government tried to force tribes to accept the allotment, the division of their lands into individual plots. The government believed that this would force the people to become for-profit farmers who would look out for their own individual interests and abandon community beliefs about sharing, belonging, and wealth. The U.S. government believed that this would improve Indian people and ready them for U.S. citizenship. But we as a community know that it also resulted in hundreds of thousands of acres of our land passing out of our control. As we emerged out of the disruption and rapid loss caused by removal and allotment, we entered a period of leadership stability. This renewed stability coalesced around Harley Palmer in the early 1900s. The late Chief Floyd Leonard used to say that his father told him, if Harley Palmer said the sun was going to come up in the west, he would walk out the next morning looking west for it to rise. Chief Palmer held the community together during the really dark times of the Great Depression, when the government very much neglected Indian people and their treaty responsibilities to the tribes. That neglect changed with the New Deal and the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1930s. In 1934, the U.S. Congress passed the National Reorganization Act, and in 1936-37, they passed the act that directly affected Oklahoma tribes. These acts were an official recognition that Indian tribes can and should continue to exist. They promised fulfillment of treaty obligations, but they also demanded that tribes create constitutional forms of government. And they largely ignored the government traditions that most tribes maintained. As a result of this pressure, our nation created a constitutional government, which is roughly the form of government we have today. After the end of World War II, the United States experienced increasing levels of stability and wealth, and as a result, the federal government was pressured internally and externally to address colonization and its destructive impact on Indian people. In response, they set up the Indian Claims Commission to deal with the legacies of broken treaties, money that was never paid, and lands that were unfairly stolen. Some within the United States government honestly realized that this was a huge injustice and needed to be dealt with. The process took over 30 years to complete, and in some ways continues on in the courts, even though the commission has been disbanded. After this period of government recognition of past injustices and attempts to right these wrongs, the pendulum came swinging back the other way. In a schizophrenic switch of attitudes, the U.S. government decided to attack Indian tribes through the policy of termination. The goal of termination was to destroy the collective identity and collective nationhood of Indians and make the people individual citizens of the United States. Termination is something that Harley Palmer fought tooth and nail. Under Chief Palmer's leadership, our community resisted this policy in an intelligent way. The late Chief Floyd Leonard always credited Harley Palmer with knowing that termination was the wrong thing for our community. As termination progressed, it became clear to the American public that the policy was horribly damaging to Indian people. Public protest pushed the policy pendulum back the other way in the 1960s. This led to the passage of the Indian Self-Determination Act in 1975. This act officially recognized the right of Indian peoples to exist as nations and to determine their own futures. This act allowed tribes greater financial control over programs provided by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, what are called 638 programs. It did not allow for complete control over government program dollars. Instead, it provided a step-by-step gradual process of increasing levels of community control and direction over services. One of the leaders who worked very hard in this era was Forrest Olds, who apprenticed and served under Harley Palmer. He was a person held in high regard among many Myamis. Many Miami people say that Forrest Olds always knew the heart of his community. He was very much a servant leader, and he knew what his community needed by listening to them with an open heart. Forrest Olds apprenticed Floyd Leonard, who became chief in 1974 after Forrest passed away. Together, Chief Forrest Olds and Chief Floyd Leonard helped guide the nation on a renewed path of self-determination. In the 1970s, we can observe the roots of a resurgence, an awakening, and it is by no coincidence that this change is connected to land. Prior to the 1970s, all of our communally held land had been allotted, and much of this had passed out of Miami hands altogether. In the late 1970s, we began the process of reversing this loss, with the Miller-Moore family's donation of 4 acres of their relatives' allotment, where the Miami Tribal Longhouse sits today, and the purchase of an old Jibo family allotment, where the tribal cemetery is today. This policy period also marked the beginnings of a return of control over the future of our youth. In 1978, the U.S. government passed the Indian Child Welfare Act that recognized Indian people's sovereign right to protect their children. Previous to this act, tribal children from disrupted homes were often sent to non-tribal homes, further eroding important cultural connections to their communities. Through the ICWA, tribes gained control over where their children went if they could not stay with their birth families. In 1988, the U.S. government passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act to help tribes determine their own future through economic development and greater financial stability. The development of casinos was believed to be one way to increase tribal resources. We have used this tool to rebuild our land base and develop our local infrastructure. 4 leaders served our nation during this era. It was a rough period of rapid changes in leadership due to the physical health issues among tribal elders. While their tenures as leaders were short, these individuals had a large hand in aiding our national resurgence, our awakening. In the 1990s, there were a whole slew of legislative changes in United States Indian policy. At the beginning of the decade, tribes began to seek greater independence through self-governance programs. These programs were a progression from the 638 programs, where tribes controlled a little bit of the money and a little bit of the programs, to a place where tribes could take control of nearly all the federal dollars used to provide their services. Services which are the legacies of the legally binding treaties we negotiated with the United States of America. Through self-governance, our nation has gained increased control over how these age-old obligations are carried out. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Through NAGPRA, the government recognized tribes' rights and responsibilities to control our cultural artifacts as well as the remains of our ancestors. For hundreds of years, institutions and individuals had basically robbed graves or purchased ceremonial items. NAGPRA opened the way for tribes to deal with the legacies of that cultural damage. Also in 1990, Congress passed the Native American Languages Act. NALA led to the initial grant programs that accelerated our language revitalization program into a nationwide effort that engaged the entire Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma in what we now call a Myaamia, the Myaamia Awaken. In 1996, we as a nation revised our Constitution to open the rolls to those in Kansas who had been forced to renounce their citizenship in the 1800s. Since that tragic period, the United States had forced U.S. citizenship on all American Indians and made it possible to be a citizen of both a tribal nation and the U.S. The tribe recognized the injustices suffered by the Kansas Myamis and chose to right that wrong ourselves. In 1998, we opened the Stables Casino together with the Modoc tribe of Oklahoma. The Stables is one of a few joint tribal casino enterprises in Indian country. It is a great testament to our leaders' healthy and enduring relationships with the leaders of other tribes in the area. In 2004, we reestablished a tribal cemetery so that community members could once again be buried on tribal ground. The cemetery allows us to come together in a communal place to mourn those who have passed, as well as celebrate their lives. In 2008, we revised our Constitution a second time to remove all reference to the Secretary of the Interior. This change communicated our belief that as a sovereign nation, we control our own destiny and no longer desire the oversight of a government parent looking after tribal children. This final image is of our honored elders at our 2008 annual meeting. It serves as a reminder of the length of our journey. These elders have seen quite a lot of it, more than most of us can imagine. We are here today as a people because of the sacrifices and hard work of the generations that have come before us. We owe much respect to our current leadership, whom you can see standing behind our elders in this photo. But ultimately, our current leader's ability to serve our nation also owes this honor to the previous generations. Since the original recording of this presentation, the Modoc tribe and the Myaamia tribe have ceased to jointly operate the Stables Casino. We would like to take this moment to respectfully thank Chief Follis and the Modoc tribe for their years of friendship and support. Though the business partnership has ended, the friendship continues ever on. Through Miami Nation Entertainment, the Myaamia tribe continues to operate the small gaming hall located in our tribal headquarters. We apologize for any mistakes that may have been made or anything that may have been left out of this presentation. Please contact the Cultural Resources Office of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma if you have any comments or questions. Mishinewe ewe makeke. Thank you, my relatives.